I think the Silent Hill 2 remake was a mistake, and if you watch to the end of this video, I think you're going to end up agreeing with me too. I previously covered the original Silent Hill 2 late last year, and in that video I went over the core elements of what makes that game as special as it is. So for this video, I want to revisit those core design pillars and see how the Silent Hill 2 remake compares to the source material. We'll be looking at the minute-to-minute gameplay, the story and characters, the endings, and we'll briefly touch on content that was cut from the game as well. There will also be video chapters available for you to skip around if you'd like to avoid story spoilers but still want to hear what I have to say about the rest of the game. Without further ado, let's visit that town, Silent Hill, once more. Exploration in the Silent Hill 2 remake is one of the better aspects of the game, especially for fans of the original title. It's fun to explore these areas remade from the ground up with modern technology in mind, and the developers recognized this too, so there are a ton of little Easter eggs and cool details to find scattered throughout the environment. This goes deeper than just visuals, however, as there are also a myriad of collectibles available to encourage players to take their time in each area. My favorite of these are the glimpses of the past, which harken back to days gone by, giving nods to different parts of levels, puzzles, and dialogue that are all iconic moments from the original game. They were honestly such a nice inclusion, and it felt almost like Bloober Team was saying, hey, this game is going to be changing some things, but don't worry, we didn't forget about you. And I went out of my way to make sure I found all of these alongside the other collectibles as well, those being the memos and strange photos. There was enough value here for me that I didn't mind checking every nook and cranny, going through all the drawers, and running into every locked door. A really cool detail that I appreciated is that as you explore, you'll actually see James take out his map and mark it up, giving players a non-immersion breaking reminder that there's new information on the map in case they need it. It reveals all the locked doors, different pathways you can take, and the location of the puzzles that you'll be solving along the way. I thought the puzzles in the remake were handled pretty well for the most part. The very first one, the jukebox puzzle in Neely's bar, has pieces scattered around the town, further encouraging you to go out and explore. You have to read notes, pick up on hints, and check out different storefronts and apartments to get all the pieces you need. It was a great way to have players spend a little more time in the town itself rather than some of the main interior locations, and they give you just enough breadcrumbs at each stop along the way. So even if you found pieces out of the intended order, you weren't at a massive risk of getting lost or confused. I also just really like that they set this puzzle in Neely's bar so that all players would be exposed to the writing on the wall that reads, "There was a hole here, it's gone now." The puzzles you may remember from the original game are still here as well, though they've been expanded in a way that I'm not quite a fan of. For example, the clock puzzle in the apartments now requires you to gather every single hand before you can solve it. Things like this felt like unnecessary padding, and though you won't notice these changes if you've never played the original, I believe a lot of people playing the remake have, and will echo this same opinion. This is far from the only puzzle that this happened to in the remake, but I don't want to spoil all of them. If nothing else, I would recommend playing with the puzzle difficulty set to normal or even easy. The combat in the Silent Hill 2 remake is the gameplay element I would say I'm the most torn on. That isn't to say it's not competent, everything feels solid, especially the firearms. My main issue is with the melee combat and the dodge mechanic. It's a heavily animation-based, context-sensitive system where James will lock onto the closest enemy to him and perform a variety of attacks depending on whether the enemy is upright, crawling around on the ground, or is stationary with low health. This can cause some issues if you're facing more than one enemy at a time and you're unable to consistently target the one you want to hit. But there's not too many situations like this in the game where enemies are grouped up right on you like this, and even fewer that you wouldn't have some ammunition to negate the problem entirely. However, coupling this with the dodge mechanic basically turns the difficulty down to 0, at least against the regular monsters. As long as you're able to memorize the attack patterns of the different enemy types, you practically turn James into the Doom Slayer. Whether in melee combat or aiming down sights, you can dodge any attacks that come your way and get right back to swinging or shooting in return. The real challenge here comes when you get to the boss fights, and there's two specific ones I want to bring up. First, there's the abstract daddy fight. I talk more about Angela later in the video, but just know I thought this entire section of the game was really well done. The buildup of walking through the apartment, then reading the newspaper article about her family, and finally reaching Angela to start the fight was super well paced in my opinion. The fight itself had a good mix of objective and damage-based checkpoints, expanding on what could have otherwise been a stand in one corner and shoot at the enemy type of fight that isn't exactly mechanically engaging. And because this is a boss fight, it's a new type of enemy, so you don't know the timings of their attacks and you're more likely to get hit, need to reposition, find space to heal quickly, and then counter with your own attacks. They also take just the right amount of damage that your resources are sufficiently drained by the end, making the next few combat encounters following the boss fight a bit more tense. That same sentiment applies to the Mandarin boss fight in the Lakeview Hotel, though it was a bit hard for me to look past how this directly conflicts with the canon of the series. Lost Memories: Silent Hill Chronicle is a 100-plus page document officially released by Konami and includes tons of information on the franchise. In it, they state that Mandarins represent feelings of overwhelming, incomprehensible anguish and helplessness, and for this reason they are not permitted to stand above ground. I don't know exactly how or why they were selected for this boss fight and then as a new common enemy type later in the hotel, and regardless of the lore implications, it was still a fun fight, but I wanted to bring it up because it caught my attention. If there's something I'm missing about this, definitely let me know. To wrap up with the combat though, I have to acknowledge that the difficulty level of a combat system is not indicative of its functionality. This is one of, if not the most fundamentally sound and effective combat systems in a Silent Hill title this side of Silent Hill 4. And I think Bloober Team's first major attempt at a true combat system was more than commendable. I would just recommend you play it on the hardest combat difficulty to get the most out of it. In my original Silent Hill 2 video, I said that the story of the game could be summed up as a commitment to character, and I believe the same applies to the remake. This was one of my main concerns with the game prior to release, that Bloober Team could potentially ruin these phenomenally written characters. But I'm relieved to say that, at least in my opinion, they didn't. In fact, I think Bloober Team actually improved upon them, something I never expected to say. I'm sure that might be a controversial thing for some people to hear, so let me explain what I mean. The characters that existed before the remake, the base of who they are, their purpose within the story, all remains the same. What the remake does is sparingly add some additional scenes or make slight adjustments to existing ones that not only give fan favorites more screen time, but develops them further as characters so their respective arcs feel more natural. One great example here is the scene where you run into Eddie and Laura together. In the original game, this was the bowling alley scene with one of the best lines in the entire series.
This town is full of monsters. How can you sit there and eat pizza?
But it's been adjusted to take place in a movie theater. There's even an achievement if you visit the bowling alley on your own and find the pizza sitting there. As silly as that line is, it's also integral to Eddie's character as it shows his unhealthy relationship with food. So when I saw we wouldn't be going into the bowling alley for this scene, I was initially worried. But once we get into the theater and find him, he's eating a bucket of ice cream with his hands. Okay, great, that part of his character's been restored in this scene, so how do they add to it? There's one line of dialogue from James where he says to Eddie, "At least you got your appetite back." And in a blink and you'd miss it moment, Eddie shoots James a look so intense, you'd swear he was trying to explode him with his mind. Clearly, James didn't mean anything by it, but to Eddie, it meant everything. James was laughing at him. He's just like everybody else. It shows a bit more of Eddie's descent into insanity over the course of the story, and all it took was one sentence and a glance. One scene that was completely added from scratch takes place in Rosewater Park. At this point in the story, James is trying to track down Laura when he runs into Angela. They have a conversation where Angela says she no longer thinks her mother is in this town, that her mother doesn't want to see her anymore. James says that he's happy to see her, and heartbreakingly, Angela questions what he means before he clarifies, alive, I mean. She almost looks like she's reminding herself that no one could possibly be happy to see her. The conversation progresses until James asks if she's seen a little girl around here, causing Angela to panic and run away. Scenes like these, whether adjusted or added, do so much to give these characters more room to breathe, and the acting across the board is nothing short of incredible. Gianna Keel absolutely knocks it out of the park in every scene, with line delivery and body language that brings Angela to life. She turned in such an amazing performance, and I couldn't have asked for a better portrayal of Angela in the remake. Luke Roberts must have felt like he had the weight of the world on his shoulders to do James justice, but he did it in spades. It's not just these two, however. The entire cast, in both their own powerful individual performances as well as interacting with each other on screen, make the world of Silent Hill 2 feel just that much more grounded in reality, as though we're no longer watching characters, but actual people in this horrifying town. There were very few scenes where things felt off, but I do want to mention one in particular, that being Maria's "anyway" line. I'm just gonna let them play side by side here in a second, but I think you'll see the original game had a much better delivery. Otherwise, the vast majority of the acting was fantastic.
Anyway, I'm glad you're alive.
Eddie!
Anyway? What do you mean, anyway?
Anyway, I'm glad you're alive.
Anyway? What do you mean, anyway?
The endings in the Silent Hill 2 remake are where most of my issues lie with the game. The safest decision here would have been to keep everything the exact same as the original, but that was always an unlikely outcome. The leave ending, which most players will get on their first playthrough, is pretty similar to the original game, but there are some changes worth talking about. They removed the song Peace and Serenity, which I think added greatly to the scene in the original, so its omission here felt odd. They also changed some of the dialogue, though I think it fits the tone the remake was shooting for, so it's not the worst thing in the world. I also didn't really like this version of Mary's letter being read aloud. I didn't feel like it had quite the same effect on me as it did in the original title. That could be down to personal preference, but I'd bet a lot of you longtime fans probably feel the same. The largest change out of all the endings, I'd argue, can be found in the in-water ending. This was my favorite ending in the original, so I'm really disappointed with how it's presented in the remake. Where in the original game, we would see the final conversation take place between James and Mary, much like in the Leave ending, it would be recontextualized as James receiving forgiveness from Mary, and rather than leaving, he makes peace with himself and he wants to join her. In the remake, this conversation is entirely removed, leaving us with an ending where James states out loud that he can't forgive himself and that this isn't what Mary would want, but it doesn't matter anymore because she's not here, before he then drives into Toluca Lake. This truly feels like the in-water ending in name alone. I think they tried to rectify this with one new addition, the stillness ending. It starts out similarly to Remake's in-water ending, where James, sitting in his car, says he can't forgive himself for what he's done. But this time Mary appears from the back seat. She comforts him as he breaks down, telling him that it's okay, granting him forgiveness. We can see a change in his demeanor as he asks if she'll wait for him, and Mary responds that she's always been waiting for him. He glances over to the passenger seat, one final look at Mary's letter, and the camera cuts to black. We hear the car start and drive before it crashes into the lake. But the audio cues in this ending are ever so slightly different from those present in the in-water ending. This time, James was not in the car as it sank to the bottom of Toluca Lake. He promised he'd take her to Silent Hill again someday. This was a burial. That's another thing about the endings. Several of them outright confirm that Mary's body was hidden under a blanket in the backseat of James's car the entire time. I know in the original it was there too. It was always something fans talked about, but that game was never as bold about it as the remake is. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, since I think it works in favor of the endings here, but it's just something worth noting. We also have remade versions of both the dog ending, which I was really glad to see return because Mira is adorable, as well as the UFO ending, which has James from the original game coming down to Earth with aliens and calling Remake James a clone. Some people are reading really far into that as Remake being part of a time loop or a fork of the original game's timeline and how James can never truly escape Silent Hill, but I'd like to think it's just a fun inclusion. The other original endings are pretty close to the source material, at least close enough that I don't really have much of a problem with them. But there is also one more new ending that was added to the game. The Bliss ending takes place as we enter room 312 of the Lakeview Hotel, where James needs to drink the White Claudia item prior to placing the tape in the VHS player. For longtime fans of the series, you'll recognize this as a hallucinogenic drug used by the Order. So it stands to reason that once James drinks it, everything we see from his perspective is liable to be a hallucination. He places the tape in the player and it starts up as usual, but this time, right where Mary should have begun coughing in the original, the tape continues to play. Mary asks James to take her to Silent Hill again someday, and James places the camera down. We now see the both of them together on screen as he hugs her and promises to do just that. Mary suggests that they continue packing, and James pauses for a moment, looking back into the camera. She asks if something happened, and he responds, "No, it's fine. Everything is fine," before the tape ends and we are shown the reflection of an empty chair where James was just sitting back in room 312. The camera pans across the now vacant room, a somber piano track filling the air, and all we can do is hope that wherever James and Mary are, they're happy. I think Silent Hill 2 is a game that ultimately should only be added to in the process of remaking, not completely cutting content out of it. Up to this point, Bloober Team have done a fairly good job at that, either reworking existing scenes or outright adding new ones, barring my issues with some of the endings. However, the most major omission from this title is the Born from a Wish campaign for Maria. This was an integral piece of the original game that, however brief it was compared to the main campaign, offered a deeper exploration of not just who Maria was to the player, but who Maria was to herself. The story was wholly introspective in nature, giving us a window into Maria's perception of her own existence and purpose, and it added not just more content but additional context as to why she acts the way she does in the main story. This is something completely lacking in the remake, as this section has either been entirely cut or is being targeted for a DLC release down the line, at least at the time of writing. Regardless of when or if it releases at all, I believe not having it in the game from the start is detrimental to the overall experience, as it robs new players of seeing a really important part of Maria's character arc. After hearing everything up to this point, you might be wondering why I think the Silent Hill 2 remake was a mistake if I've had arguably more positive to say about it than negative. Well, I do genuinely believe it was a mistake. Emphasis on was. When the game was first announced, and over subsequent trailers, press releases, and leaks, there was a lot of material to be concerned over as a fan. Even more so when taking into account that Bloober Team has had anything but a spotless record when it comes to horror games with heavy subject matter. But against all odds, not only did they actually listen to fan feedback, but their publisher Konami gave them the time and resources to make changes rather than rushing something out the door in an unfinished state or outright canceling the project. Both things they have been known to do in the past. The Silent Hill 2 remake was a mistake, but it's one that Bloober Team learned from during development and can continue to do so now that the game is out. I still don't think that it should be someone's first introduction to Silent Hill 2 if given the choice between this or the original. There are some things that just can't be done better than they were way back then. But it would be disingenuous of me to sit here and tell you that this is a bad game or that it isn't worth your time, either as a lifelong fan or as someone who doesn't have a copy of the original game but still wants to experience this beautiful story. I liked the Silent Hill 2 remake as a supplementary game to the original, not as a replacement. And I think the lessons that Bloober Team learned here could really have a positive impact on their projects and the whole series moving forward. So after playing the Silent Hill 2 remake, am I crazy for thinking the Silent Hill franchise has a bright future ahead? Well, I can think of another word for it. Hopeful.